So if you want to come, please sign your name so they'll know how many people are going to be there. And also, Rabbi Brockman will be here tomorrow afternoon with Rabbi Kish. They're going to be speaking. And it's on the eve of Tish B'Av, which is in the Jewish calendar. It's a day that commemorates catastrophe. We say that the two temples were destroyed on this date, and that the Holocaust happened and the Inquisition. We sort of commemorate these catastrophes. So this is it begins the holiday commemoration begins Saturday night into Sunday. So Rabbi Brockman will be speaking about this in the last session tomorrow, and Kish will be speaking about African Jewry, which will be great. Okay, so welcome back, and today we have Professor Yossi Shain again, and then the question, is it a question or a statement? How Israelis understand anti-Semitism. And this to me is a very profoundly important issue in the contemporary context, because before you'll start, I think there's a tremendous schism between the condition of Jewish communities in the diaspora and the understanding of global anti-Semitism as a strategic threat to the state of Israel by Israeli leaders. And perhaps October the 7th is part of the underestimation of the ideology of the Brotherhood and anti-Semitism. So on this note, Professor Yossi Shain, thank you for being here.
It's like waking up in the morning and talking again about the Jews. It's a prelude to the catastrophe.
To light.
Oh yeah. As we were having breakfast, and I felt we were eating too much also. So it's like I remember meeting many years ago at Georgetown, former Congressman Glickman. Glickman was a congressman from Kansas, a Republican. And he was not elected to the Congress at the time. This was like, I think, the second term of President Clinton. And he was part of the Republican, was Bob Dole as the head of the Republican majority at the Senate at the time. So I met Glickman, who moved to California. It became something in the motion picture, like a big job in California. But prior to that, during Clinton's administration, he was the agriculture minister. So we started to talk. I forgot why he asked to see me at Georgetown, and I said, it was really such a nice guy. I said, why did you become the agricultural minister? Or secretary of agriculture? He said, it's a great question. He said, during the hearing on Capitol Hill, they asked me, what is your credentials for being secretary of agriculture? So he said, I told them, I have a Jewish mother. So I said, a Jewish mother? Wow, it's related. She said, she always said it, and he spoke in Yiddish. Es, eat. So he said, that gave him the credentials to be so whatever it is, it's I don't know if it's a Jewish trait or not, but it's certainly the idea of eating and conversing. As I start to reflect this morning about the subject that I gave you about Israelis and their perception of anti-Semitism, it also relates to what I said yesterday. Those of you who attended my talk about the question of power and victimhood. The very essence of the creation of the State of Israel was all about the idea of getting rid, ideologically speaking, of the notion of victimhood, as I explained. The idea of controlling your own fortune, the idea of taking your fortune into your hands, the idea of creating Jewish heroes and warriors rather than just the scholars and so on became very important. Ben Gurion, of course, was the founding leader, but not only him, founders of Zionism, but Ben Gurion in particular, emphasized the Jewish warriors. We reconstructed in Zionism the heroism of the Maccabees in the Second Temple era, which of course had sovereignty as an example of sort of like their struggle against the Greek and their ability to rebuild an independent nation. We talked about even the Bar Kokhba revolt as a sign of never yielding, not as later on as the catastrophe that it was brought and the calamity after the Romans have defeated them badly in 135 AD. The whole notion of the warriors became much more important. The story of Joshua and David was the glory of the warriors, not the glory of those who are kind of like being defeated. So anti-Semitism as a notion of people who are hated and attacked and abused as a perception was not fitting well with the notion of the recovery of the heroic Jew in his or her motherland, the ancient land of Israel. It's rather the stories of the warriors that became much more pronounced and much more critical to the legacy of the Israeli state. Also, the creation of the genuine Israeli, what we call the Sabbath. So like this man who walks barefoot and walks the land as if it is, he owns it in that respect, is a very important factor. He's not a foreigner in any place. He belongs. The idea of belonging is very important. Therefore, you have to know the land. All the idea of the youth in Israel, the youth movement, which was created early on with the Zionist movement, was all about sort of like really introducing the new Jew into the land of Israel, recreating the Jew as a member of a place to which he or she belongs. In the old days, they didn't say he or she, but I'll say he or she belongs. It's indeed this case. The land that he or she belongs. There are no foreigners. Anti-Semitism was kind of like a symbol of foreigners, of people who are not part, who are sitting among the goyim, so to speak, those who are not Jews, and therefore they are susceptible to this type of treatment. Not the Jew. The genuine Jew is the idea of a genuine Jew, authentic Jew, the authenticity. Authenticity will wipe out anti-Semitism in many ways. Authenticity, heroism, fighting forces, bravery, all of those traits. Physique was emphasized also, rather than just like the brain, the halachic Jew of the diaspora. Now, this notion of the anti-Semitism and the belonging, of course, relates to the idea also of the Jewish relations to exile. Jewish relations to exile has a long history. And, we began, you can say, as a people of the land, Zera Israel. Zera Israel, the seed of Israel, preceded the Holy Seed. Preceded the Holy Seed. The Holy Seed became pronounced mostly, as we know, in the exilic moments. The exilic moments in particular that we have documented in the Babylonian time, where the whole idea of a holy community, the idea of people who cannot dwell in their land and are susceptible to the whims of those who are hosting them as a host country, is a very important factor in this notion of anti-Semitism, that you are dependent, fully dependent on the foreigners, not only dependent on their goodwill and their abuses, but also dependent in terms of your mere survival. If it's the Assyrian exile, of course, they dispersed the Israelites and they disappeared. In Babylon, they were kept, so to speak, together in several places. It was a short time. So the very idea of the exilic moment led to the re-emphasize or the emphasis on the more notion of sanctity rather than ethnicity. Sanctity rather than ethnicity became much more pronounced. And then the sanctification, of course, of Judaism, the Kedushat Israel, the idea of the holiness, the idea of the worship of God, the idea of the text eventually, the fact that the Gvil, the very idea of the text itself, was elevated as something that we sanctify, the reading of the Bible, the notion of Nashim Nochriyot, the notion of foreign women, was at the exclusion of the foreign women as part of the theology, was all among the idea, was all in the level of what is happening in the exile. Some people said we moved from the holy seed to the, and of course, which was kind of like the descendant of a holy seed, to, of course, what we call in Judaism, the traits of being a Jew is born to a Jewish mother. The notion of motherhood is much more important than it used to be before. So when the recovery of the state of Israel, it was also to get rid of the notion of the exile moment. Israel was supposed to put an end to the cycle of exile and recovery. The notion that we have somehow moving into what you call the catastrophic cycle. In many ways, the diasporic or the exilic time was bereft of history. Think about it. The Jews didn't write any history, none whatsoever. From Josephus Flavius all the way to the 19th century, there was not even one book of history. Just studying the Torah. They created a corpus of biblical or kitvei kodesh. But they did not create any history. They themselves refused to speak about history. Until today, ultra-Orthodox don't talk about history, and they don't see even the Holocaust as a historical event. It is not by mistake when the recovery of the new yeshivot, the ultra-Orthodox yeshivot in Jerusalem and Bnei Brak and so on, are all named after the kehilot, the communities in Eastern Europe, those were destroyed. There is no kind of a sense of history in that respect, because it's not about history. It's not about history. It's about the text. It's about the Talmud. You study it. While Zionism was all about recreating history in the image of the heroism of the biblical story. Zionism was the nationalist movement of return, and the references were not related to susceptibility or to victimhood, but rather to victories and heroism. So this is part of the legacy of Zionism, which also made the point that there is no future, supposedly, for Jewish people if they continue to reside in exile. Keep in mind, notwithstanding the fact that Israel, when Israel was created in 1948, was finally established after the British Mandate and the War of Independence and so on. They were in Palestine later on in the new state of Israel, which was created, which was announced in May 15 of 1948. There were about 650,000 Jews. Very quickly, this group of people took command of the idea that they represent the Jews wherever they may be. A little bit of chutzpah, but that's how it was. At the time, American Jewry was 11-fold larger than Israeli Jews. And the idea of going to Palestine and later on to Israel was kind of like, okay, those who didn't make it to America made it there, so to speak. And even you know, when I grew up, the uncle from America used to come and look at us, at this natives give us $20. We say, wow, Galiji. That's how I remember it. My uncle from Brooklyn coming, giving us $20. Now, of course, the Israeli high-tech give back some $20 to American Jewry. But this was the time, sort of like that you have to understand the gravity of this type of discrepancy. The Jewish state, Ben-Gurion saw it, the future is here. And the future is here because all the vulnerabilities that exilic Jewry experienced under Christianity, the Muslim societies, and later on in modernity, will be somewhat arranged here, and we're going to fight for it, and we'll arrange it. Of course, when I speak like that, it's very broad strokes. It's not, you know, it's history, 101 history for elementary. But nevertheless, I'm trying to paint it as to understand where we are in terms of like perceptions. You don't need to get into the details of that. And that kind of like was that debunking exilic Jewry or debunking the life of exilic Jewry was all about the idea that there is no certainty in the life of exilic Jewry. There is only uncertainty because of anti-Semitism. Even if you are settled in Britain, they will kick you out. Even if you are settled in France, they will kick you out. Even if you are settled and you think that you defined the German ethos, and you define Bildung, and you define what it's all about, suddenly you will find yourself as an outsider. Let alone in other places where you are a dehimi, kind of like a minority that is not worth, like in the Muslim world. The very idea of being authentic and independent is only in Israel. America, of course, presented the challenge to the founding fathers of Israel, as I mentioned yesterday, because America had a different promise, the new promised land, where ethnicity didn't matter, supposedly, where, albeit they had racism, and they were trying to move eventually to kind of a colorblind society. We have here the warriors of those struggles. But for the Jews, America provides kind of a promise that there will not be endemic anti-Semitism. They will be able to be citizens. They will own America. The Jewish idea was we create America. If you look at the very story of America and Jewish life, you see that American Jews wanted to create America. And even American Jewish organizations, when they fought for liberties and rights, including American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, B'nai B'rith, they tried to speak the language of universal rights, not of ethnicity. Because America didn't believe in ethnicity. They had, of course, the Jews, with regard to ethnicity, were trying to get rid of it, perhaps, during the emancipation in France as well. But as we very well know, already in 1808, Napoleon kind of took back and created the consistoire as something that will monitor the Jews as an ethnic group, because the Catholic always warned against them. So the very idea of anti-Semitism was the disease of the outside world that can be overcome. It's a disease that could be overcome. Nazi Germany and the extermination of the Jews in Europe was, of course, the culmination of this warning of Herzl and others that there is no really future for Jews outside their own sovereign land. And yet America was an exemplary kind of like model that many people thought this is much better because we get both prosperity, we are not hated in a structural fashion, and in any case the blacks are lesser because they are a race. Jews were not defined as a race. And we will recreate America. And they did, in fact, we're moving to recreate America. This sort of alliance with America. The notion of Judeo-Christian tradition. As if these are two cultures that are moving together. So America was supposed to erase anti-Semitism. And when Blaustein came to Ben Gurion and said, we are not going to be, you are not going to call us exile because America is our homeland. Ben Gurion was worried about losing American Jewry and told Walter Eitan. Walter Eitan was the general manager. I don't know if he told him, but Walter Eitan, I know in the documentation, was the director general of the foreign ministry, designated American Jews not as exile, but rather as diaspora, tfutza, a more neutral term that eventually became kind of like a designated, somehow related to people in the mother country, but not people who are debased, not people who lack their homeland or lost their homeland. This was the legacy of Zionism. And when the migration started of people from Arab lands after 48, those who left Arab lands and came to settle in Palestine, became Israel, of course, in Israel. And those survivors of the Holocaust who came to Israel to find themselves a safe haven. And he didn't go to America. Some of whom did go to America very quickly. To this new land. The land, kind of like the promise was that this will create a new nation, a melting pot a la America, a new melting pot, with the emphasis on mamlachtiyut, the mamlacha, the kingdom. Mamlachtiyut, the state. We elevate the state. We elevate our, and the Tzahal, the idea of the IDF, Israel Defense Force, will really define almost everything. This was the symbol of our heroism. When I grew up, and those of you who grew up in Israel, I know some of you grew up in Israel, remembers, we used to put during Independence Days all the pictures of the commanders of the army with the flag of Israel. We knew every unit in the army. The heroes were also received biblical kind of like accolades. Moshe Dayan and others, you know, they were like they're walking the land like heroes who conquered the land, who recovered the land. Masada style sort of like story of Yigal Yadin, the chief of staff who became a minister eventually and an archaeologist, was here. We are digging our past. The past was digged above the exile and above the diasporic moment. It was an ancient past. That's our past, not the past of being members of other peoples who are being debased in Christianity, susceptible to attacks by the Christian church, only with the defense of al te'argum, don't kill them, just let them live as long as kind of a symbol of a remnants of the Jews in the time of Jesus, as it used to be, by the Catholic Church. And not susceptible to the Lutheran attacks, etc., not susceptible in that respect. Anti-Semitism will recede. It is going to be a memory of the past, or part of the disease. They spoke in this language, the disease of the exilic life. Machalat hagalut, the disease of exile. That's why when the survivors of the Holocaust arrived in Israel, they kind of like, they did not even get the empathy, because they didn't struggle. As I mentioned, they went like a sheep to the slaughter. That was the charge. That's the language which was used. While we, the Israelis, those who grew up either in Palestine or later on the state of Israel, we were the authentic. We spoke the language. They spoke the language of the land. We didn't speak. That's why in Israel they erased as much as possible the generation of my grandparents. So like the generation of my parents who grew up already in Palestine wanted to erase foreign languages. Speaking to Gilad this morning, who speaks 13 languages, he told me. And I became so envious, because when we grew up, you had to erase the language of the grandparents. They spoke German, they spoke Yiddish, you were ashamed that they speak like that at home. Yakira will tell you that, right? How this was all about kind of like the authenticity of the Hebrew. Recovery, the Hebrew language. This is the authentic language. So there was no really room for anti-Semitism. No empathy to anti-Semitism. Only a solution to anti-Semitism. And the solution is, pack your bags and come. And toil the land and work the land. It really meshed with also initially with the socialist idea of the recovery of the land. All the idea of the kibbutzim, the moshavim. You toil the land, it belongs to you. Eventually, as we will see, and it's a footnote, move forward, the whole idea of the settlers in the right wing of the recovery after the 6-Day War also came with the theology. The theology will become a little bit later. It was there, but the theology of a recovery, of the Jews coming back as kind of a tale of a story of recovery, of a God-giving redemptive moment. This was, the pronunciation of that was much later pronounced after the 6-Day War. It was there. It was Rabbi Kook's father, but the first, but it was not as pronounced. What was pronounced was the modern Zionist creed, which had its own kind of like orientations, from a more socialist orientation to the Jabotinsky orientation. Doesn't matter. It's not a lesson kind of like in early Zionism. This is a background, what I want to tell you, that by and large, the notion of anti-Semitism was looked down at in Israel. And in the end of the day, we also had like years where anti-Semitism was, after the Holocaust, was unfashionable. It became also unfashionable in America. It helped even in the struggle of the African American, because racism became unfashionable in some ways after the Holocaust. And they help in the integration. How can it be that African American or Black Americans at the time coming back from the war fighting can face same sort of racism that they fought against in Europe? It's a legacy of part of legacy of the United States. And I'm not by mistake moving between the United States and Israel, because these are the two communities that became much more important. Because all the other communities, all the others, with variation, we even heard about Libya, kind of like were either wiped out completely or at least indirectly suffer from anti-Semitism of the period of fascism and the Nazis. Indirectly. Those, of course, who suffered directly. So this was the culmination of the whole idea. Where, of course, anti-Semitism morphed many times, and we heard yesterday, and we'll hear, I guess, maybe more, between the religious anti-Semitic to the modern anti-Semitic, which is a completely different story. Even the religious anti-Semitic, it was all the tale of the destruction, and the fact that the Jews were punished, and the fact that they cannot recover. When Herzl went to Pius X, the Pope, and asked him to recognize Zionism, Pius X, of course, told him, what are you talking about? We cannot recognize you. You abandon our prophet. And of course, the legacy of Christianity is the replacement theory, that we replace you. You cannot recover your homeland. Recover your homeland means that you're alive. Only with the Nostra Aetate in the 60s, that there is a talk about the Jewish and the legitimacy of a Jewish homeland, coming to terms only with in the 90s, with the church of the Catholic Church recognizing eventually the state of Israel. Only with Benedictus coming to Jerusalem and laying a wreath on the tomb of Herzl in 2014, suddenly there was kind of a recognition of the Zionist cause. Until then, Zionism was not accepted, kind of like an aberration. But reality, we had to accept the church, and then there was a recovery issues. Do I talk about too many issues, or you are with me?
We're with you, we're with you.
Okay, because I include lots of things, and but what can I do? We're on track. Okay, it's early morning, and we all had breakfast at least. That's the most important thing, right? Yes. So now I want to get to my subject much more, because we're talking about now, and we don't want to get into history only. Because initially, the notion of anti-Semitism became important to the Israelites, as I call them, the Israelim, as the country was taking shape and form. And they were trying to also erase religion. They were trying to kind of like, if not completely erase religion, but basically the heroes were not the rabbis. They were, for Ben-Gurion, the notion of ultra-Orthodox learning, which has become such a big issue today, that they're not joining the Israeli army, was no more than a tourist attraction. Few people will sit and learn and study. Let's keep them as remnant of how Jews look like in the past. It's not something which would yearn to. It will erase itself. It will finish itself. There is no really... who would have known that they will erase us? By and large, who would have known? That if this trajectory goes, this is how it will be. But that's how Ben-Gurion saw it. That this is something remnant of the past. Anti-Semitism was a key factor in the justification of Israel, not of the violations just of the Jews as the story. The story of Zionism is the story of a recovery in an impossible notion of living among the outside world. When Jews became exposed, Israeli Jews, to the Eichmann trial, that's what the first time in the early 60s, when sympathy to the victims of the Holocaust, when the notion of the Warsaw Ghetto and the heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto became important, that the Jews did, in some ways, rebel. They did not just like passive victims. And eventually, when you have, and this is much later, that Israeli students and Israeli going to Auschwitz for an annual kind of visits, and the military soldiers going to Auschwitz as a sign of never again, this will become later. This type of trips that Israelis are taking to the extermination camps as a way of kind of keeping their history as a memory. When Israeli Air Force airplane flying about Auschwitz, it's sort of like to show that one day we'll fly above Iran. We are not going to let it happen. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. If you talk to Shkedi was the head of the Israeli Air Force. And his father was the story of his father who survived the Holocaust and told him, remember, son, we don't have religious Jews, this Jews, all the Jews were in the crematorium. That's what he told them. And Shkedi sort of like was the man who kind of like took it as an issue, as a great guy, by the way. So over time, the Israelis kind of like moved into normality, with developing of new types of understanding of modernity and of Judaism. The evolution of the Israeli state was abrupt in the sense of growing population. We are only now less than 8 years old. The population has grown 15-fold or so, from 600,000, or now, as I said, we are 8 million, maybe less than 15-fold, but at least 12 or 13, and it's growing fast. More migration from the exilic movement from time to time when attacks come in Britain, perhaps less, in France, here and there, in Iran, wherever it is, Jews are coming. It's kind of an influx is endless. In Argentina, you mentioned, and from time to time they come from America, not out of duress, perhaps out of other motivation, including religious motivations. The idea of the Six-Day War, the glorious victory, cemented this notion of the superiority of the Israeli existence over the alternative America. Because it created the Israelization of diaspora Jewry. Diaspora Jewry who before could not see any heroism in Judaism as a nationalist trait, but rather only integration in their countries of domicile, now adopted Israel and instead of perhaps praying, donations to Israel and organizing for Israel became the key issue. Israel was the focal point. It will grow to be the focal point, including helping Israel. But not kind of like to a nation that is going to be wiped out as they thought perhaps prior to the Six-Day War, but rather to an heroic that can be strategic ally of the United States, that can be sold is a completely different story. Not a story of victimhood, but a story of a victorious nation, forward-looking nation. The struggle against to release Soviet Jewry was part of it. A combination of an interesting combination, because Natan Sharansky will speak here. Will tell you that the Natan Sharansky story, in my opinion, and Natan will say differently, maybe, I don't know, was much more entangled in the minds and hearts of the Western world with the notion of the struggle between America and the Soviet Union on détente, on freedom versus evil, than in the struggle inside Israel, Shalach et Ami, on the issue of anti-Semitism. It was important for us, but as I remember it, it was not as essential in the ethos. When Natan Sharansky came and got the Medal of Honor, you ask in Israelis, do they know Natan Sharansky, the young Israelis? And they don't know Natan Sharansky.
Or the young Americans.
Yeah, but young Americans different, but young Israelis, we knew him later on. Of course, when he came and became kind of a, but the legacy of Soviet Jewry, which was an important factor in our life, one should not underestimate that. It's broad strokes, but I think the story that the Jackson-Winnick Amendment, 1974, the idea of the Cold War and the idea of the Helsinki Accords and all of the above, Natan Sharansky and the refuseniks and the prisoners, it became an American story as the Jewish Americans sold it. Was Dershowitz writes about it and so on. If you read his books also when he has a whole thing about it. While of course, the Mossad was working and Nativ was working. These are these agencies of the security echelon, intelligence echelon to release Soviet Jewry. But as a legacy of the struggle, it became later. I remember that only in the late 70s we start to sing Kachol ve'lavan ze tzeva sheli. Blue and white is there was a song of the refuseniks of sort of singing this kind of like appreciation of those who are fighting against anti-Semitism in the idea of coming to Israel. While many, of course, wanted to move to America, and we had to stop them. Remember the deal that Israel struck with Austria, that they will direct them to Israel and not allow them to go back to America after they're leaving the Soviet Union. This is all history. We have to move forward. Nowadays, we go forward. What is today anti-Semitism? Is it an issue in Israel? First of all, you have to understand that Israelis are divided in broad strokes, politically and otherwise, to two segments that Netanyahu understands quite quickly, and it was discussed with his advisors in the election. One is perceived as those who are Jewish by religiosity. Jewish by religiosity means that there is, in the continuum between religious and secularity, this is the regular continuum, right? Between how religious you are and how secular you are. And you put yourself in this. I'm like ultra-Orthodox, I'm a conservative, I'm modern Orthodox, I'm a Reform, I'm traditionalist, and so on. And eventually I'm a secularist. The idea of secularist is kind of like I'm cherishing other values. It's not, religion itself is not, while for traditional Jews, and especially North African Jews, there was no such distinction. On the continuum, there was never a place for secular Jewry. It was always perhaps less observant, more observant. You speak to North African Jewry or what we call Sephardic Jews, there was nothing of that nature saying, I'm a secularist. And that also started to change in France with the arrival of Tunisian, Algerians, and Moroccan Jews. So the idea also became imbued more and more, the notion of anti-Semitism, with the question of the identity of Israel. While anti-Semitism was perceiving the story of the recovery of the modern Jewish state with Ben Gurion, with Pinsker, with Herzl, with Moshe Hess, all those kind of like East European or West European, so the story of Europe and modernity, in Israel it became more and more involved in the issue of religiosity. Because the idea of religiosity became much more important to Zionism. The story of Zionism, which had, of course, roots also with Kalischer and Al-Khalai in the 19th century, who spoke about it, but they were in the margins of the Zionist kind of like thinking about kind of like God moving us into the promised land. Or later on, Soloveitchik, the very idea of the Kol Dodi Dofek, the four knocks of my uncle knocking, and how can we not hear? Let's go. It's something, it's kind of like prophetic, it's redemptive. The notion of redemption became important more and more. Not for the ultra-Orthodox community, but of course for the religious Zionist. Religious Zionism became very important segment of the Israeli public, and I will say the dominating sector today in the ethos of the country. There is no other segment in the country which has such gravity in terms of impact on perception of the, I would say, the future of the country and the future of Judaism. Maybe the ultra-Orthodox, but that's a different story because it is not related to the country itself or to its future in terms of geopolitics and territory and so on, but rather to the notion of maintaining the kehilot, the Orthodox kehilot, the dedication to the study of Torah, the parshanut and so on. So the religious Zionists became a very important factor. And therefore, after the Six-Day War, the whole experiment of Zionism gradually became imbued with the notion of a redemptive moment. redemption. And that kind of also interacted eventually, not necessarily by design, and today, with the evangelical kind of perception of the story of the Jews moving to Palestine or to Israel as a way of sort of redemptive moment for Christianity. I remember Abe Foxman once told me, I said, Abe Foxman, you know, how can it be that you have like this kind of story that eventually the redemptive moment means that the Jews will convert to Christianity and so on, and Palestine said, and you are such good friends with the evangelicals. So Abe Foxman in his funny manner said, Yossi, we need allies. When it comes the end of the day, we'll renegotiate. That's what it was. You know, like, don't confuse me. You know, this was the idea. So Zionism became more imbued with religiosity and the story of anti-Semitism. Not that it came back, but because of our conflict, because of the nature of our enemies that Charles is leading, you know, like with jihadis and so on. These were kind of like new materials, not only materials for stories, but new realities to be reckoned with about Jewish hatred. Jewish hatred in the Arab land, in the among the Muslims, was mentioned here and there, of course, but it was also another story, which we learned as we grew up, that the Jews, in fact, among the Muslims, had a good life. You know, they were not persecuted, they were like maintained, they were kept as a respectable minority. There was no really Holocaust there. It's the Europeans. It was not the Arabs. Of course, it was not like they were never full-fledged citizens in the same manner, but no one was, in fact, in the Arab land or the Turkish Empire. So the story was that they were not so abused. They had respectable life. And until today, there are those who were kind of like, of course, cherish this moment of flourishing Jewish communities in the Muslim world. The talk of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world was very minute. It was very small. Among those remnants of the communities. Even today, you know, when people of Persian descent, many of whom moved after the revolution of Iran, in 1979, will talk about their yearnings for the Iran before the revolution. It was not kind of like something that they were, you know, or Moroccan Jews for that matter. There is a whole, what's his name, Peter Geffen. You know, Peter Geffen has like his group called Kivunim in America. He takes Jewish American kids, privileged Jewish American kids, to trips in the world to show them how Jews lived in the world. And one of the destinations is, of course, Morocco and Essaouira and other places. And the Jews kind of like how the community flourished. It's not that the Moroccan Jews were not flourished. They did flourish in the story. It's not that they had like exilic. Later on, the notion was that they're all kind of like expelled. The 700,000 refugees of Palestinians, sort of the War of Independence, were compared to the 700,000 or more of Jews who were forced to leave the Arab world. But anti-Semitism was not discussed in the context of traditional Jewry that came from the North African countries. When religiosity became so pronounced after the Six-Day War, and the victory was, and the recovery, of course, of the Wailing Wall, the old places in Judea and Samaria, as a sign of redemptive moment that we are coming back to the land above and beyond what we already accomplished in the War of Independence in 1948. A whole theology was created which also impact the question of anti-Semitism. First of all, it gravitated mostly to the discussion on the Israeli-Arab conflict. It gravitated to the notions of the Arab hate, Muslim hate, and of course radical Islamism as opposed to Judaism. The Muslim Brotherhood was more emphasized. Richard Mitchell, in his famous book on the Islamic Brotherhood, which was published in 1974, I think, the first edition, I think, in 1974. It is not a big issue there. It exists there on the notion of anti-Semitism, but it didn't exist there. And he was really, it's still, I think, the most important book on Islamic Brotherhood. Only later on was the kind of like the idea of Islamic radicalism, which became so pervasive after the downfall of the Arab nationalism in the 60s and 70s. As I mentioned yesterday, and I think to have to re-mention, when Begin spoke to a Foxman about anti-Semitism in Egypt, he said, it will work itself out. It's not an issue. It's a bilateral relations will work itself out. It's not an issue. So the whole issue was, of course, remnants of the past, will never be the same, and the question of America, which kind of like was not perceived as some anti-Semitic threats, because American Jewry also didn't want to emphasize anti-Semitic threats. The talk was that we are safe here. The vulnerabilities of French Jewry, or British Jewry, or Argentinian Jewry, or any Jewry for that matter, was all in relations to what happened in the context of the rise of Islam in Europe, and of course in the Middle East. So the question of anti-Semitism, which was completely related to the vast majority of Jews in Europe, think about it, by the late 19th century, there were about 7 million Jews only in the confines of the Russian Empire. More Jews than are in Israel, or more like the same. So basically the idea is that Israelis were not educated on this kind of anti-Semitism. It was not their subject, it was someone else's subject. But when it came to the religious component, the question of eternal enemies became much more pronounced. And who are the eternal enemies? No longer the Christians. Not, of course, Western Europeans. Of course, those in our midst, the Nuhbas, the terrorists, the ISIS, these are eternal enemies. They need to be defeated with power. And the language has changed dramatically and theologically speaking. How much? I have like 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Initially, the idea was, of course, politically speaking, was Rabbi Kook was the idea of settling the land, dwelling in the land, conquering with what the West Bank or of Judea and Samaria, coming back. Similar to the notion of the pioneer spirit that came in the early days of the modern Zionists or the socialist Zionists. Gush Emunim, the idea of the faithful, how do you translate it? What's that? Yes, became sort of like we have to do so. This is our right to conquer the land, our right, and so. And criticism started to be leveled, sort of how much right do you really have? How much you should conquer? Should you talk about two-state solution? All that you know, all the way, and it's not. We understand that they are somewhat irredeemable, but we can still negotiate with them. All the way to the peace accords which we're trying to sign in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, when it all collapsed in the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was kind of like a signpost for the Israelis to say, okay, this is unresolvable. We cannot have something with the Palestinians. And the theology exacerbated of the idea that the eternal enemy, what needs to be done. So there was no more negotiation with the enemy. The enemy is anti-Semitic. The enemy is anti-Semitic, and it explodes in Europe and other places. We don't deal with, of course, anti-Semitism in America, here and there, Tucker Carlson. This is, Israelis don't understand this type of, they understand when they see the demonstrations on campuses, with the kafiyas, from the river to the sea. This they understand. And this has been important for the discussion of justifying lots of things in Israel, of why we cannot live side by side with these enemies, because whatever we will do, Hamas will want to kill us. If they stay alive, they will kill us. Because the idea of eliminating the state of Israel and the Jewish people is so entrenched in the ethos of radical Islamism. The gravest danger. And indeed, there was no negotiation with the in the Hamas idea. There is no negotiation whatsoever with this entity. I'm not saying that the Palestinian, more secularist Mahmoud was the chairman of the Palestinians, sort of denying Holocaust, whatever, and Arafat is. But they were more secular. Supposedly you can come to some rational understanding, which is dividing the land. You get this, you get that, okay, we are okay. Here is kind of like Islamic radicalism is the enemy that needs to be addressed. Under this kind of typology, the whole ideology of the Israelis vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, especially of the religious Zionist camp, segments of the religious Zionist camp, became much more extreme. While Israelis themselves became globalized. Israelis became globalized for years. They travel the world, they feel comfortable in the world, they feel no threats in many ways, they don't see anti-Semitism. They don't see it. They felt that they can invest in any part of the world. They were rich, much richer than they could have imagined. Was the high-tech, was the startup nation, all over the place. They didn't feel that they are singled out as Jews or Israelis. On the contrary, they were celebrated. Of course, celebrated in the Far East. Because in the Far East, there is kind of like reverse racism, you know. The Jews, you know, like they're geniuses, you know. We want, you know, like how many Nobel laureates they have, you see? This is how they do it. So this idea of like we are in fact not only debunked, we are celebrated. This was the Israelis. They go to study abroad, they reside, they can live universal life with a foothold in Israel, because the state of Israel is providing security and identity and continuation. While for religious Zionist Jews, among the leadership, the notion was not globalization and values of a universal creed, but rather as the tribe of keeping the tribe, because the tribe is always threatened. And if you see the division of Israeli politics, it's exactly that division. What they call right-wing government, whatever it means. It's not right-wing in the sense that they all hold the same position. The ultra-Orthodox have nothing to do with Zionism and they believe in the state, but they are perceived right-wing. How can they be right-wing when they are even anti-Zionists and don't want to serve in the army? It's quite ridiculous. They're anti-nationalist and anti-Zionist, and they're still perceived as the right-wing coalition. Why? Because it's the Jewish kind of component, as I explained. While the others are in a coalition of what we call the value coalition. More values, less values, more patriotic right-wing, and more universal. This is like kind of like, and with religious beliefs, but this is not what dictates. What dictates is other components. Ethnicity dictates, belonging to the Jewish people dictates, yes, patriotism, yes, but it's a modern nationalism. And of course, other traits, economics, certain values, pluralist society, a good life. We are, you know, like building communities. This is what the Israelis value. What kind of like what we call the secularists. They're not completely secularists. They still celebrate holidays and so on, but that's not the key. It's not a religious component. Therefore, anti-Semitism became the issue of the religious Zionists, and with the theologies that became extreme. This has grown so dramatically in the last few years because of what I described in my last lecture on the concept of the idea of Jewish exclusivity. Jewish exclusivity came to fight what they regard as eternal hate of the Jews, that we want to fight it, and they are eternally hate, and we're going to fight it. We cannot remedy it. And we also don't want to be integrated into the world in a universal fashion. We want to emphasize Jewish singularity all the way up to Jewish superiority. So who are these big guys? And we see it today because we have a huge debate. After October 7th, as Daniel Goldman in his fascinating essay, and I said already something about Daniel Goldman, they should know who we're talking, so he's not a suspect. Daniel Goldman wrote this fathom long, from mythical theology to political violence, the dangerous logic of Palestinian elimination. Daniel Goldman, a right-wing person, the head of Gesher, which brings kind of like relations, a religious guy from Bet Shemesh, who was the president of the International Bnei Akiva, no less. By origin here from England. That's why I bring him here. And he explains how kind of this debate are becoming so now difficult for his children's generation. They see the danger of anti-Semitism, but not in the same fashion as the diaspora. They see it in different terms, and there are theologies in these camps that are becoming more considered to be superior, dealing with Jewish superiority, rather than with the danger itself. I'll just read the last sentence or two, and you'll understand what he says. And I will end here. Israeli society, maybe you can, I can't see so well.
No,
Israeli society, and in particular the religious Zionist sector, must promote ideas that can compete with and defeat the radical concept. There is room, an urgent need, for a religious and political thesis that offers full-throat Zionism, patriotism, and strong Jewish identity without falling into a supremacist, racist, or eliminationist ideas couched in theological terms. The fate of moderate religious Zionism, and perhaps Israeli democracy itself, may depend on whether these trends can be reversed before they become irreversible. That's what he warns. Because the threat of anti-Semitism, if it cannot be overcome, as it perhaps could be overcome before, in the move to a sovereign state, but rather in kind of a permanent Amalek-style war. Amalek is the eternal enemy. He considers it to be a grave danger, or the conceptual understanding of Israelis. Israelis, after October 7th, found common cause of fighting the devil that came to attack them. And you could see a unity among Israelis that we have to kill these bastards, what they did to us. We cannot live side by side with them. The point is, okay, so what's next? Are you doomed to an eternal war with the theology? Or are you, or can you, I don't have good answers, come to some conclusion of some terms of arrangements, political arrangement, diplomatic arrangements? I am not sure what is the answer to this. But this is how today the political realm is bifurcated in terms of the position into the future of Israel. This kind of like a perpetual war, or some form of arrangement in the Middle East, because we did have peace with other people. We did extend our hand, and they extended to us. And they, when Israelis go to Dubai, they don't feel threatened. On the contrary, they storm Dubai en masse when Israelis are in other places. But there is still this kind of like a conception of where the anti-Semitism is. So I'll stop here because I said enough.
Thank you very much. So thank you. Brilliant as always, but of course I have to critique. Can you hear me? It's okay. So the title of your talk was How Israelis Understand Anti-Semitism.
Don't hear you.
I will share the mic. So I was saying, Yossi, thank you. You're brilliant as always, but I'm going to, be the nudnik and critique. The topic of your presentation was how Israelis understand anti-Semitism. When I listened to you, I made Aliyah when I was a kid. I was in a tenure track position during the dot-com crisis at Tel Aviv University with you, and I left and I didn't come back. When I listened to you, I was thinking, damn, it's time to move back to Israel, right? Which is the ethos of Zionism, of what you were expounding. And it's attractive and important and kind of miraculous that in our lifetime, this is the reality. But on the other hand, my colleagues and I, for more than 20 years, have been screaming and yelling and pleading and demonstrating and studying and showing, and have colleagues in this room, telling the Israelis to wake, I don't want to use the word, I'll skip it, but wake the blank up, because there is a strategic threat, not just to the galut, backwards, hunched over, subjected Jew, but this is a strategic threat for the state of Israel, for the warrior state, for the proud Jew, for the fighting Jew, for the Jew that got back to our land and reestablished our land. And this is a strategic threat to Israel. This is a strategic threat to the democratic institutions and principles in Western countries. And that we need the state of Israel to be engaged in the struggle against anti-Semitism, not just for the Galut Jew that is experiencing something that I think in the Israeli ethos is separated from, but it's a threat to the very existence, I would argue, of Israel. And we can see that young Western Europeans and North Americans are being inculcated in this demonization of who we are. And that if Israel, we heard before in other lectures, if Israel is an apartheid, racist, genocidal, occupying entity, it must be liberated from the river to the sea. And there's a license to kill. And these are the little characters that are going to be in charge of the State Department and of the New York Times and of Oxbridge and of the Ivy Leagues. And I don't know if we're past the tipping point, but we're approaching it, or we've approached it.
We don't have any argument. It's not a critique.
So from your perspective, when you sit with government officials,
I don't think we have any argument. I think what you're pointing is important.
Good. So now, tachlis, from an Israeli perspective, what are Israelis going to do about anti-Semitism instead of wheeling out Shikli to embarrass everybody?
Look, Shikli is in certain embarrassment, and I'm not dealing right now with government position. I was asking about Israelis' perception of anti-Semitism. That was my call.
So what do we do?
What you're saying is,
what do we do?
You say, look, guys, there is something there. There is something which can grow. David Harris has articulated yesterday the danger of this wall that the American Jewry built after the abandonment of the Jews in World War II in order to protect Israel and American Jews together, and this may crumble as well. Absolutely, this kind of like the whole idea of what's his name? I forget names. The guy, was the Minister of Justice of Canada.
Cutler.
Irvin Cutler. Idea that the Israel is the Jew among the nations, and so on. Absolutely. But you talked about the Israelis, not about what's going on, like what we see geopolitics now.
So what do you think we should do? What should Israel do?
First of all, Israel should get its act together. But its act together is not just about anti-Semitism, about who Israel is. I didn't deal with it. We have to define who we are and where we are going. We are a country, as I said, that is wrestling. Right now there is a struggle, a very important war, lingering war, and we see what is happening. And we see how people are exhausted by this war altogether, 2 years of war. But the question of who we are, whether democracy, a Jewish state, we saw the demonstration, we see the rupture in Israeli society. I mentioned yesterday the study that was done by the JPP, by the Jewish People Institute in Jerusalem. Mr. Rosner, Shmuel Rosner, publishing that 60% of Israelis think that there will be a civil war in Israel. So do they have time to think about how others hate them when they hate each other? It's a big question you're asking me. I don't have any answers. I'm telling you. So the internal divisions about who we are, what we are, between religion, secularity, all of these issues are much more critical for the Israelis. And of course, one can argue there is also, it's not just a structural issue. I don't believe it's a structural issue. I believe it's an agency issue. I think it's a political issue. And I don't want to say terrible words only if you push me, and sometimes you don't have to push me for me to say it. I really think that in Israel, there are thugs governing the government, governing Israel, thugs. People who are under no circumstances could be part of governing the state. But they are there, supported sometimes by such ideologies of Rabbi Lior, of Rabbi Tau, and all these guys who are absolutely nutcakes. Now, you can say, but they are elected. Yes, they have been elected. I'm not saying they're not. But this is the reality. And I'm talking here with people who are right-wing Zionists, Jabotinsky type Zionists, like Avigdor Lieberman and others. Consider them, I don't want to speak on his behalf. I don't like to speak on any other's behalf, my behalf only. But they think, you know, what do you want from us? So what you're saying is absolutely right. We have strategically to understand, because we are eroding our own kind of like positions right now. Not only because the war in Gaza is so complex, we talked about it. How to fight against Hamas is so complex. Because if you have like people like Minister Eliyahu, whatever his name, all kind of like names that coming from time to time, and are talking about the need to exterminate all of this, say, well, Galiji, okay, how can we use this kind of language? What is going on? And everybody will quote that. And then they will give justification for all the nutcakes in New York that in any case wanted to eliminate us, as you say. I don't have good answers, Charles. But you are trying to awake Israel, but Israel has many other issues to deal with. The Israelis I talk to you, how do they perceive? What do they learn? What did they learn in school? What do they see? Can they see the big picture that you're describing and you deal with 2 decades? They don't deal with it like this. They have avoided the issue for many, many years. They didn't deal with it completely because they thought it's the issue that only the diaspora Jewry has to care about, not us. That's what I was trying to say. I do not at all have any argument with you. That's why I'm coming to ISGAP to work with you.
Where we are?
Okay, I don't live in Israel. My parents are Israeli. My daughter made Aliyah in 21. I spend a lot of time in Israel, but I don't live in Israel, and certainly I'm not an academic in Israel. But the fact that I'm not an academic in Israel, I think, is a different perspective in terms of, in the US, and very, like, the way that you're talking about Israel is kind of the way I would be talking about the US. Because my world is an academic world, and that's who I'm engaged with. And even the people that I'm close with who are not academics are highly educated, and this is the bubble I live in the US. When I go to Israel, I spend a lot of time with the soldiers, because my daughter was a soldier, and this is her whole world. And I spend a lot of time talking to taxi cab drivers, and I spend a lot of time talking to Americans who live in Israel, who have moved to Israel. And I spend a lot of time talking to my family, none of whom are educated in Israel. And I get a very different perception. And of course, we can't essentialize all Israelis by any means, and we can't even essentialize the primary conflict. And you come out, we hear this study that you're citing, and that's very troubling, and yet it's not what I'm seeing at all. And what I'm seeing is more of a, like with many times, that the protests aren't as representative of all Israelis, and that many Israelis who certainly have opinions on judicial reform, and of course everyone has opinions on this war, but that they're more annoyed by the protests than anything, regardless of what they believe in, because it's blocking their traffic and they're trying to make a living, and they don't work in high tech, and they're just trying to, get to where they have to go, especially among the soldiers who also can't get to where they have to go when the protests are blocking the roadways. And that there is this what you talked about this, I think, as if I understood it correctly, that there is a split between those who believe there's an eternal enemy, and that this is like a theologically based belief, and then the rest of Israel. And it feels to me like there are many in Israel, not based on theology at all, who are also coming to the conclusion that there's an eternal enemy from a
Exactly
place
what
of...
I said.
Okay,
It's
so
exactly what I
the-
said.
that they're
The
both
unity, the
believing this.
unity after October
7th, as you said, was about Israelis coming together, say Yachad, because they said eternal enemy. They didn't have a theology, but the theology kind of was feeding it into this, yes.
So I'm gonna, my last thing is that I guess my wish and my question for you is the more optimistic version, I think, is to see Rachel Goldberg pull in. And I think many saw her as kind of an ambassador of Israel and as a new direction where, and she is Dati Leumi, right? Like this new direction that Israel can go in that is not so fraught. And I want to hear what you think, if there is an optimistic perspective.
There is a big optimistic
Perspective, I was trying to describe something very particular. You don't need Rachel Poland, who's really an incredible lady. The polls are showing that Smotrich is not crossing the threshold the next elections because of the issue that he signed with the ultra-Orthodox against service of the ultra-Orthodox in order to keep the coalition. And Bennett, supposedly, politically speaking, represent this type what I talked about. Modernity, religiosity, but not crazy religiosity, but more of diplomatic kind of idea. Redemptive, but also realistic and modern. That's the notion of Bennett always presented himself. He's a light religious Zionist with also a high-tech credentials, and a man who served in the army, and a man who understands what service for the state and state institution, who also sat in coalition with all the members of including even with Arab Mansour Abbas. That was his in government. That's his vision. That's his vision against those who consider him enemy. Don't forget, they consider him a traitor. Bennett was considered a traitor. That's how he was pronounced. Shikli left Bennett because of treason that he considered, or Silman. Bennett was for them the man who betrayed them. And that's how it was. The demonstrations against him in his house, or Urbach and that I was privy to, that's how they defined him. He had to, so this is, but when you say this is the optimist, this is for those who want this type of life. For others who have other theologies, this is a disaster. This is something which, and therefore we are in a position that people do not find common ground. They did find common ground initially after October 7th because there was a common enemy. With years passing by and so on and so forth, by nature you don't just feel the common enemy. You see what is happening, people are killed in the army and so on. And so the story is changing, just as the movie that we saw on October 8th, you already have additions to the movie, back and forth, back and forth. The history is moving very fast in Israel, every day. So I can give you my leanings. I can give you, if you want, it's not a question of scholarly or not, what I want to happen because of my own leanings. But it doesn't mean that other leanings are not there and have their value for those who have such beliefs, and you have to make decisions. The same as you say, Israelis who are moving to buy property in Cyprus. So okay, so what? I say yes, so what? It's a big country, it will survive one way or another. That's how it works.
Thank you again. So, two things. The first is a quick clarification. Just checking. When you mentioned that Jews were, when they came to the United States, I think you mentioned something like they were not marked as people who are to be debased. Was that maybe like at Ellis Island, like when they came in?
Later on, look, I've written extensively. I don't want to get into it. Of course, there were of course Christian kind of like biases and so on. Anyone who read, like joining the club, about the universities, the exclusion, and what happened in Rhode Island, but eventually the story, the massive migration from Eastern Europe to the United States between after the pogroms of the 1880s, all the way to 1924 to New York, where today many Jews are saying, what will happen? They're going to have a mayor who is calling for a global intifada. You know, like this is what the biggest Jewish city in America, or perhaps in the world. So the Jews are saying, well, what is happening here?
I understand. So
and
this is making more sense. You
Yeah.
just made it make more sense. After this talk, I now am seeing something a little more clearly. First is that at the mention of the 60% that are convinced that they'll need a civil war inside of Israel.
I'm not saying they're convinced, they think.
They
civil war is
yeah,
imminent. They don't.
think.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
So-
what the survey shows.
Sure, so I'm thinking that that's similar to some of the turmoil in the United States around trying to get straight on who the enemy is, whether or not we fight each other first or whether or not we have a common enemy. So that's something neat that I'm seeing as a similarity. And I've realized in the last 24 hours the dependence that people have had on critical race theory as something that's very important. I don't have that because I rely on the understanding of the transatlantic slave trade, the complexity of it, not the oversimplification of it in some weird one theory. I realize this because I've had several conversations with people who are saying, wait a minute, what about CRT? What about CRT? And I realize what behind that desperation is if we let go of CRT, we're not acknowledging racism toward African Americans. CRT is something that came along way after as a trendy thing. I just realized the rhetorical strategy, the mindset that it has over people. And so I'm now putting that together with the need to understand the harder things and to walk and chew gum is the saying that we have. You've got to work on the civil side in order to have enough manpower to fight the big enemy. And it seems like, oh, the civil stuff is just useless. We don't need to work on the soft skills.
Let me say,
Look, in such a lecture, I presume a certain understanding of my previous lecture. Maybe I should have not.
No.
Because yesterday I made the point about the Israeli century. We talk about Israel because Israel is the epicenter of Jewish identity and Jewish life, in my opinion. It is, as I said, divorced in many ways, not completely, from the realities of America with the transaction, what we talked yesterday, the issues that are pertaining to American history, to the big debate that are going on in America. The idea of what is happening here with Donald Trump and the American academic institutions on the issue of anti-Semitism, Israelis are absolutely unaware of or not knowing much about. For them, these are different issues, what I'm saying. Different issues. It doesn't mean that there is no connection, and what Charles is trying to say, there is like deep connection, we say, but the perception of Israelis that I'm trying to tell you are not completely imbued in this culture of what is happening in the United States. Much different.
They are.
They are, but it's a different language even.
Yeah.
All right, last question. We're out of time almost.
Okay. Two remarks. One, to Charles, you said what Israel can do, should do about this. There is the classical Zionist answer to this. Make Aliyah. No other solution. Make no mistakes. We shall give you hell if you want to come to Israel. And you'll suffer and maybe think that maybe you have done the worst mistake of your life, but there's no other answer. This is the first thing I want to say. The other second one is I want to, there is a question I want to ask Yossi. I ask it in the Israeli style, which means I know better. This is the way my students usually used to ask me.
with you, I agree.
You know better. Go ahead. Now let's go ahead.
Okay, so what actually happened in Israel? Part of the problem in Israel right now is that the initial Zionist program, which is also the greatest success of the Zionist revolution, which is perhaps the most successful revolution in the 20th century, and which was not without bloodshed, remarkable, is the constitution of a state. Now, what does it mean in my mind is that it was the politicizing of the Jewish people, which has become, by the creation of the state of Israel, transformed from a diaspora people to a state people. Now, well, I don't have the time, we are all hungry, so I just give one, perhaps, indication. The Zionist religious movement in Israel, which is supported by many, by the way Americans, newcomers to Israel, who come from half theological, half religious reasons, is they have this movement of the Zionist religious, so to speak. They have their own Shilush Kadosh, the Holy
Trinity.
The Holy Trinity, which is Am Israel, Eretz Israel, Torah Israel, which means the people of Israel, the Torah, and
The land of Israel.
and the land of Israel. What has disappeared? The most important thing, the state. And this is something that we encounter all the day. And I think you said to me yesterday, I was surprised to learn that you are a right-winger. I'm a left-winger. I think that the big historical mistake of the Israeli right is to align itself to this, the people who carry this symbol of the Holy Trinity.
Look, as you said, you know better. I will not challenge you knowing better. I will grant you. I'll just say,
But-
no more answers. Charles, cut me.
No, I was trying to make a joke. Go ahead.
But what I'm saying is, my talk today, keep in mind, based on what I spoke yesterday, those of you who were attending, is looking at the challenges, because we talk a lot about anti-Semitism as intricacies of Zionism, and anti-Semitism became imbued. To be an anti-Zionist is becoming anti-Semitic in the minds and hearts of many, in the definition, IRA, and so on and so forth, right? For the Israelis, the situation in the conceptual understanding is completely different than the diaspora life and the diaspora challenges, especially in the American context. You're absolutely right. The Israelization process, which I talk about, diaspora Jewry in France, and I spoke about yesterday at length, in Britain and others, for them, the solution is moving to Israel, and that's it. And if it's a safety issue, if they are fearful for their life, just move. And indeed, it has been a triumphant success. Israel has become the home of world Jewry. That's why we began. It's the Israeli century. It's a success story. Now we have to deal with the challenges. Charles is telling us the challenges begin here in Washington or in New York, on the campuses and so on, and what we see with institutions and so on. And I say, it's not that it doesn't exist there. The issues of Israel are redefined. We believe, as I said, with power. Power will bring allies. It will not be in the West, it will be India, it will be China. They all appreciate power, and our power extends also to cyber power, to a technological power. We will have friends, and these friends will be, and they will not start to think and just will have like demonstrations, because demonstrations is a sense of vulnerability. We have a sense of power, and this power will lead us to the promised land in a sense, and we can become global people, because we will have to defeat our eternal enemies, and that's the emphasis. We don't deal with other issues in that respect. Internally, we have issues. That's what we're trying to say. We have issues to resolve about identity of the state and so on. You define yourself as a lefty, whatever, I belong to a right-wing party. We both agree in some degree on the same issues. We don't live with a redemptive theology. We live with modern sort of solutions. For you, give them a little bit more land. I say give them nothing. Whatever it doesn't mean. But it's what we both agree on, the domination of power. You and I agree. Domination of power is securing of the state. And then How much do we need? How much we don't need? This we will negotiate. That's the only difference. But the cleavage is much deeper, and that's what I was trying to stress, and that's it for today.
Thank you.
Yossi, thank you. So everybody enjoy your coffee break or tea break.